Competition, Chapter 11. The best definition that I can come up with for competition is an interaction of individuals over a limiting resource that leads to a decreased fitness of at least one of the competing individuals. Keep in mind there's two things there. One, the resource is limiting. There's not enough to go around. And two, it's harmful to at least one or both of the competing species. So, interaction of individuals over a limiting resource that leads to a decrease in fitness of at least one of the competing individuals. Competition can be interspecific, that is between members of different species, or it can be intraspecific, between members of the same species. Again, competition is over a resource, and that resource can be space, food, shelter, a whole host of things. Anything that's required for the survival of the species could be competed for. Competition is difficult often to demonstrate clearly in natural populations. Here we have an experiment in which two kinds of warblers, orange-crowned warblers and Virginia warblers, which compete for one another, or at least presumably compete for one another, were examined. In panel A on the left, I want you to look, the control is a situation where both orange-crowned warblers and Virginia warblers are present. Removal would be when one or the other species has been removed. Panel A looks at the number of fledged individuals per nest. In other words, how many offspring were able to grow from hatch from eggs, grow through chicks, and fly away, fledge to fly away. Here what we see is, when comparing control versus removal, that the removal of one or the other competing species causes an increase in the number of offspring that make it to fledgling stage. That certainly seems to show competition, because warblers protected from interspecific competition fledge more young from their nests. But what I want you to see is that's what's taking place, but there's really a proximal cause to this, which is what makes looking for competition in the natural world so difficult. And that is demonstrated in the second panel, panel B, which is on the right side. Again, the control, both species present. Removal, one or the other species has been removed. In this case, what we're looking at is the proportion of nests that have been preyed upon. What you see is the removal of one or the other competitors causes a decrease in predation. So, although the warblers are in fact protected from interspecific competition, those warblers that are protected from interspecific competition fledge more young from their nests, this is largely a result of much less nest predation. So there's an interaction between predation and competition. Why I'm explaining this to you is I want you to understand that it's difficult often to clearly demonstrate competition in the natural world because of these interactions that take place. There are a variety of mechanisms of interspecific competition. I'm just going to define them here, and we'll talk more about them in class. Exploitative competition is competition in which one species reduces the amount or availability of a limiting resource. Whereas interference competition is when one species actively inhibits another from obtaining that resource. Preemptive competition is a mechanism that ensures access to the limiting resources, usually by early establishment in the area, that is first come, first serve. Diffuse competition is competition in which the combined effects of two or more competitors rather than a single competitor is significant. So it's interaction of multiple species. Okay, before we go any further, let's just review. Limited resources lead to competition between species as well as within species. Competition is empirically demonstrated, though often difficult to do, but empirically demonstrated by showing that the resource is limiting and that the interaction between the species has a negative impact on one or both of the competing species. As a result of competition, or maybe the way I should say it is, the factors that affect competition are going to be the degree to which the species overlap in the requirements that they're demanding from the environment. The degree to which the competitors overlap in resource use and reliance on a particular resource will affect the intensity of competition. In this graph here, what we're looking at is some range of resource. Think of it as temperature or seed size or moisture conditions. And on this axis is simply success. And what we find is there's some low range where they are barely successful, some high range where they're barely successful, and some average at which they're highly successful. The other key point here is there's two species here, just species 1 and species 2. And what we see here is that these two species have virtually the same make virtually the same demands with respect to this particular resource, whatever it is, make virtually the same demands for that resource in the environment. As a result, we say they have complete niche overlap, which makes them complete competitors. And that is really a condition that cannot exist in the real world, because what will happen is something over here that will get what are called niche petitioning. That is, what will happen is the two species will become separated from one another, will be driven apart, if you will, over time to reduce competition. So this condition of perfect niche overlap is not possible. What you'll get is this condition. And this is embodied in something referred to as the competitive exclusion principle, which says that if two species share the same niche, that is, if they have perfect overlap of their resource use, if they share the same niche, the weaker competitor will be eliminated and the stronger competitor will survive. If there's the possibility of partial overlap, which is shown on this side of the graph, if there's partial overlap, what we'll often see is divergence take place, where niche petitioning takes place. What is this thing that I'm calling the ecological niche? The ecological niche is the combination of the resources and physical conditions that a species needs to survive. It's its requisites for survival. The niche is going to be multidimensional because there's certain amounts of moisture, certain pHs, certain temperatures, certain light conditions. You put those each together and you can define a space in which the species can survive. The number of dimensions to the niche will be the number of limiting resources or conditions necessary or requisites for survival for that species. When species have overlapping niches, they tend to be competing. And the greater the overlap, the more intense the competition. There are two kinds of niches: fundamental niches, which are the theoretical niche that a species would have in the absence of competition, and then a realized niche, which is this set of conditions that are actually used by a species dependent upon the interaction of that species with other species in the environment. So the realized niche is what we see in the real environment. Again, this ecological niche is a set of biological and physical parameters that determine the growth, survival, and reproduction of that species. It's often referred to as an n-dimensional hypervolume because you're going to sort of construct this theoretically in this hyperspace to define all the requisites for survival that that species would require. As I mentioned before, we will see a situation that when there's resource overlap, niche overlap, that what will happen is niche separation. That is, the more overlap, the more intense competition can happen, more intense the competition may be, and what will happen is we'll try to separate or drive those species apart. Other factors that affect the intensity of competition are population density and frequency and intensity of disturbance. Population density you can think of as there's more and more individuals, there could be more and more intense competition for a particular resource. A resource becomes more limiting, and therefore competition would become more intense. Frequency and intensity of disturbance is more difficult to predict, but what we're seeing here is that more frequent and or intense disturbance will often drive populations down because the environment is unpredictable. It'll drive the population down. Think of floods or fires or windstorms, and decrease the number of individuals. That keeps the population density down, and that might decrease the intensity of competition. Okay, ecological niche is central to competition because it's based on this critical use of resources and this simultaneous use and the degree to which that simultaneous use occurs. Resources exploited by a particular niche may be biological, such as prey size or prey type, or physical, such as temperature, pH, etc. Disturbance can lead to lower population size and lower competition, resulting in less intense competition. This concept that no two species can have exactly the same niches, that have perfectly overlapping niches, is referred to as competitive exclusion. Two species with similar needs for the same limiting resource cannot exist in the same place. This is, as I said, referred to as competitive exclusion principle, CEP. This states that one species will be excluded and the other will survive as a result of interspecific competition. I want to show that in a sort of laboratory situation. This is actually work done by Gauss, I believe in the 1920s. He grew two populations of Paramecium, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum, both separately and in mixed populations. So the blue lines show each species grown in monoculture. The orange lines show both aurelia and caudatum together, and what he's doing is plotting the number of individuals of each species versus the length of days. So he ran this for a little over 2 weeks. And if you look at the top panel, aurelia, you see that when grown separately, it has higher population sizes than when grown in mixed population. So this difference between this blue line and orange line is really the impact of Paramecium caudatum on aurelia. Down here, again, we're looking at caudatum growing separately, caudatum growing in the presence of aurelia. Again, this difference in blue line between orange line in this case is going to be the suppression of the population, that is the sort of competition that we see between caudatum and aurelia. And if you take a moment and look at these two graphs, what you see is the impact of aurelia on caudatum here is much larger than the impact of caudatum on aurelia here. So aurelia is the superior competitor and actually drives the Paramecium caudatum to extinction. That's referred to as competitive exclusion. Okay, so he was able to show this excessive restriction of the ecological niche result in extinction of, in this case, Paramecium caudatum. If you have only some overlap, that is, some minimal overlap of the niches or resource use, then we get this condition known as character displacement. This is competition-driven divergence of the two species into different parts of the environment. Here's a good example of this. These are Darwin finches on the Galapagos Islands. The bottom two graphs here are looking at the length of the beak versus the number of individuals that have that particular length of beak. And so they were organized into categories, into size classes. And what we see here is these two graphs show the range of bill sizes in these two species when they are alone on an island. That is, island that just has this particular species, island that just has this particular species, okay? And what you see is that when the two species are not together, are not present simultaneously, they have very similar bill lengths, beak lengths. On the other hand, when you have sympatric populations, that is, the two populations together on the same island, look what happens. It's referred to as character displacement. Look what happens. The two species are separated from one another. The actual character, bill length, changes over time such that this particular species in orange has generally smaller bills or beaks, and the Fortis species has larger or longer beaks. So this is referred to as character displacement, because the competition between, when the two species are together, the competition between the two species drives them apart. This is referred to as character displacement and can result in adaptive radiation, that is, the formation of new species and the development of new species in the environment. Another result of niche overlap would be niche separation or petitioning. Here we're looking at 3 species of warbler that use the same spruce tree. What has happened here is instead of competing for use of the entire tree, they have subdivided the tree into sections. The Cape May warbler near the top, the yellow-rumped warbler at the bottom, and the bay-breasted warbler in the center of the tree. By regionally separating the tree, they are separating themselves, separating their niches, and therefore reducing competition. Competition results in immediate and long-term effects on the species. Competitive exclusion is the most important intermediate effect, and that's this idea that if they have very strong or maximum overlap, one will be driven to extinction and the other will survive. 2 important long-term or evolutionary effects of competition are increased competitive ability and character displacement. Coexistence is possible in the natural world if the niche overlap of the 2 species is small and the carrying capacities for the 2 species are similar. If these conditions do not hold, then the result is competitive exclusion, and one species will be driven to extinction and the other will survive. Now, this is just the basis of competition. I want to develop these concepts more in class, but I need you to take some time and be sure you understand these definitions so that you understand the basic concepts that we're going to explore with regard to